We are all used to thinking that after the end of earthly life, a person is awaited by an amazing world of afterlife existence. But in reality, everything is far less bright than we would like. There are things people prefer not to talk about, things left unsaid, the disturbing and frightening facts that may await us beyond the boundary of life. Watch this video until the end, and you will learn what chilling confessions were shared by those who have crossed the threshold of our world, and why some, upon returning to life, screamed in terror. Many doctors who face death daily gradually become hardened and devoid of sentimentality. When asked what awaits a person after death, they often reply, "Nothing." He simply becomes fertilizer for the earth. The same opinion was once held by the resuscitator Rawlings Moritz, Doctor of Medical Sciences, President of the Institute of Cardiology of the state of Tennessee, and former personal physician to the President of America. For almost 20 years, he devoted himself to the noble task of bringing people back from the brink of death. For a long time, he wasn't interested in what happened to them afterward. He simply didn't believe in any afterlife. However, everything changed after one particular case that not only overturned his worldview, but also completely altered the course of his career, compelling him to closely study what is now called the experience of life after death. One day, a middle-aged patient was brought into the intensive care unit. His heart had stopped. At first, everything followed the usual routine. The doctor performed all the necessary procedures to save the man's life. For him, it was just another ordinary day at work. But later, something happened that Moritz described this way. After all the necessary procedures, the patient finally regained consciousness, but looked terribly frightened. He trembled with fear and whispered, "Doc, if I had the strength, I would scream." I had never before seen a person so terrified by what he experienced beyond life. Usually, people after resuscitation are confused, exhausted, or grateful for being saved. But such panic the doctor had never witnessed before. This reaction deeply puzzled the cardiologist, and, driven by curiosity, he asked the patient what had caused such horror. The man explained that after death he found himself in a deep pit, where it was dark and unbearably lonely. He was shaking, drenched in sweat, and begged the doctor not to let him go back there again. Nevertheless, even such an emotional confession didn't impress Moritz much. He considered it merely a result of extreme stress. After all, the man had survived clinical death, and likely that would have been the end of the story. However, a few days later, the doctor visited the patient again to check on his condition and carefully brought up the subject once more. To his astonishment, the man sincerely replied that he remembered nothing of the sort. "I'm sorry." "Doctor, but what are you talking about? I didn't feel any fear. On the contrary, I met a kind and beautiful young woman about 20 years old. She told me she was my mother, but that's impossible. My real mother looks completely different." Such an answer completely baffled Rawlings Moritz. After such an answer, Rawlings Moritz was even more puzzled. Not only had his resurrected patient denied his terrifying visions, but he had also told something truly inexplicable. The resuscitator realized that he would not find peace until he discovered the essence of what had happened. Without informing the patient, Moritz contacted his father and told him everything, both about the son's dreadful visions and about the mysterious woman who had appeared to him on the other side. The father's words literally stunned the doctor, making him marvel at what was happening for the third time. It turned out the man had been married twice. His first wife had died when their son was still a small child. Not wanting to traumatize the boy, the father decided to hide the truth. He never spoke of his first wife and had never shown her photographs. Later, he remarried, and the boy grew up believing that his father's second wife was his real mother. But it was the deceased first wife who was the patient's true mother, the very woman who met him beyond the boundary of life and death. This story left an indelible impression on Moritz. A doctor who had always relied on science and rational thinking suddenly faced something that defied logical explanation. He began to seriously wonder, what really happens after a person dies? From that time on, Moritz began carefully interviewing all the patients he managed to bring back to life. He asked what they had seen, heard, and felt at the moment when doctors were fighting for their lives. Through years of observation, the doctor came to the conclusion that beyond the boundary of death exists another form of being. However, unlike other researchers who described mainly peaceful and radiant visions, Moritz collected dark and unsettling testimonies. These stories were filled with fear, pain, and despair. They forced him to view near-death experiences differently and recall the existence of hell and the torments of sinners. He concluded that not everyone finds peace after death. Retribution is inevitable, and in this, according to the doctor, there is no doubt. Rawlings Moritz conducted countless interviews and experiments. He wrote, "I spoke with everyone who was successfully resuscitated. About 20% agreed to share what they had seen after death. Their stories dispelled my skepticism and ignorance. I became convinced, beyond death, there is life. I have often observed that the dead continue to see and hear the doctors while in the room. This can be verified. There is no doubt they truly perceive everything, even when their hearts have stopped beating. It seems that living people suffer from spiritual blindness to the invisible world, while the dead, on the contrary, acquire an expanded perception." In addition, Moritz noted an interesting pattern. If a person is questioned immediately after returning to life, they are more likely to describe frightening experiences, darkness, fear, and pain. But over time, consciousness suppresses these memories, leaving only fragments or complete emptiness. This observation made the doctor think, perhaps most stories about the light at the end of the tunnel are merely echoes of what the mind allows us to remember, protecting us from a truth too terrifying to accept. That's why sometimes the afterlife may seem like paradise. But as the stories of those who have survived clinical death show, things are far from simple. Many of them describe the beginning of the transition in the same way. First, a person sees their own lifeless body, realizing that they can still see and hear everything happening nearby. Then their soul leaves the place of death, moving through a dark corridor. However, not everyone's journey ends with light. Many recalled that instead of light, they found themselves in a cold and gloomy cave or at the bottom of a deep pit. Darkness, dense fog, and disturbing silence surrounded them. The inhabitants of these places looked like shadows, emanating horror, despair, and hopelessness. In that realm reigned desolation, apathy, and the complete absence of hope. Some said they tried to escape the darkness but felt an unbearable weight, as if a massive stone pressed upon their shoulders, preventing them from rising. Gradually they began to understand this burden was their own sins. It was their misdeeds that kept their souls trapped below, not allowing them to ascend toward the light and peace. The weight of one's actions seemed to become tangible, real, robbing them of the chance to break free from hell. Few dared to speak about such an experience, for it forces one to face the truth that terrifies and exposes the darkest side of the human soul. The mind itself strives to suppress these memories, protecting the person from the horror they endured. That is why the testimonies of those who share their experiences immediately after returning to life are especially valuable, while their consciousness has not yet built psychological defenses or erased the memories. In the final years of his life, Rawlings Moritz said, "Since ancient times, mystics have claimed that life after death exists. But only today, thanks to modern technology, are we truly beginning to touch this great mystery. Perhaps existence beyond death is not only an enigma, but also humanity's final hope." The extraordinary encounters my patients described had the deepest impact on them, completely transforming their outlook on life and what lies beyond it. None of those who experienced such things remained atheists. Each person must decide for themselves what to believe in. But if all this is true, then it is worth reflecting on one's actions and, before it's too late, cleansing the soul of that which may drag it into darkness. Share your thoughts about this in the comments. Support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new stories about the mysteries of the afterlife. Thank you for watching. Wishing everyone light, peace, and goodness.